February 14th, 1945. Iwo Jima. 0600 hours. The volcanic ash still hung in the air like a morning veil, suspended between sky and earth, as if the island itself had not yet decided whether to belong to the living or the dead. In a collapsed aid station barely 20 meters from the shoreline, beneath twisted metal sheeting and shattered timbers that once formed a Japanese field hospital, Lieutenant Yamamoto Keiko pressed her palm against the arterial wound of a young private whose name she would never learn. Her hands, once steady and precise during 3 years of military nursing training in Yokohama, now trembled with exhaustion. The morphine had run out 6 days ago. The bandages, for days prior. The hope, she could not remember when that had disappeared. Around her, 17 other nurses worked in near darkness, their white uniforms long since turned to the color of the island itself. Black, gray, red. They moved like ghosts through the ruins, stepping over bodies they could not bury, treating wounds they could not heal, whispering prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned this forsaken speck of volcanic rock in the Pacific. The youngest among them was 19. The oldest, 34. None believed they would see another sunrise. The American bombardment had been ceaseless for 72 hours. Naval guns that sounded like the footsteps of giants walking across the ocean floor. Artillery that arrived, not as individual shells, but as a solid wall of steel and fire that erased entire grid squares from existence. And through it all, the nurses had remained, because that was their duty, because the Bushido Code demanded it, because abandoning the wounded was unthinkable even as abandoning themselves seemed inevitable. Keiko did not hear the American Marines enter. She only felt the sudden cessation of sound, that peculiar silence that follows violence, thick and cottony and wrong. She looked up from her patient, whose breathing had already become shallow and irregular, and saw them. 5 American medics in spotted camouflage uniforms, their Red Cross armbands brilliant white against the gray destruction, their faces young and frightened and impossibly clean. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The nurses had been taught what to expect from the enemy. They had attended lectures where instructors described American savagery in clinical detail. The rape camps, the torture chambers, the systematic execution of medical personnel who might testify to war crimes. They had been issued cyanide capsules, small glass vials now tucked into breast pockets and boot linings, a final mercy they could grant themselves when the inevitable came. Lieutenant Yamamoto's hand moved instinctively toward her collar, where the capsule rested against her collarbone, warm from her body heat. Her fingers found the small bulge beneath the fabric. She thought of her mother in Hiroshima, of cherry blossoms in Ueno Park, of all the springs she would never see. She prepared to bite down. And then something happened that would haunt her for the next 47 years, until her death in a quiet Kyoto hospice in 1992, surrounded by grandchildren who knew nothing of war. The American medic, a corporal named James Morrison from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, whose own hand shook as he entered what remained of the aid station, looked directly at her. Not at her uniform, not at her nationality, not even at the dying soldier whose blood had pooled around her knees. He looked at her face, and in his eyes, she saw something she had been told Americans did not possess: recognition of shared humanity. He raised both hands slowly, palms out, and spoke in broken, badly accented Japanese that he had learned from a phrase book during the voyage across the Pacific. Watashitachi wa ishadisu. To Sukru. We are doctors. We help. To understand what happened next in that ruined aid station requires understanding a collision not merely of armies, but of entire civilizations separated by vast differences in how they conceived of duty, honor, and the value of a single human life. The Japanese Military Medical Corps of 1945 operated under principles codified over centuries of samurai tradition, where the individual existed only as a component of the collective, where suffering was noble, where death before dishonor was not merely encouraged but mandated. The nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army had been trained as extensions of the warrior class, expected to demonstrate the same unflinching commitment to duty as the soldiers they treated. Lieutenant Yamamoto Keiko had graduated from the Tokyo Women's Medical College in 1941, among the top 5% of her class. Her entrance into military service was not conscription, but volunteer service, driven by profound patriotic conviction and genuine belief in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. She had treated soldiers in China, witnessed horrors in Nanking that she had learned to compartmentalize as necessary evils in service of empire. She had hardened herself deliberately, systematically, because softness was weakness and weakness was betrayal of the divine wind that would carry Japan to inevitable victory. The American Medical Corps, by contrast, emerged from a fundamentally different philosophical foundation. While Japanese military medicine emphasized collective resilience and acceptance of mass casualties as inevitable costs of warfare, American military doctrine treated every preventable death as systemic failure. This was not sentimentality, but pragmatism rooted in industrial thinking. Soldiers were valuable assets requiring substantial investment to train and equip. The U.S. military had pioneered forward surgical teams, rapid evacuation protocols, blood banks, and antibiotics not from humanitarian impulse, but from recognition that medical efficiency translated directly to combat effectiveness. But beneath these doctrinal differences lay something more profound. The average American combat medic in the Pacific Theater came from a society where individual life possessed inherent value independent of service to state or emperor. They had grown up in towns where the fire department was volunteer, where neighbors helped raise barns without expectation of compensation, where the highest virtue was not glorious death, but meaningful life. This cultural programming ran so deep that most could not have articulated it, yet it manifested in 10,000 small decisions made under fire. When Corporal Morrison entered that collapsed aid station on Iwo Jima, he made no conscious decision to treat enemy wounded. His training simply did not include categories for worthy and unworthy patients. There were only wounded, and the wounded required treatment. This approach baffled and terrified the Japanese nurses in equal measure. The first nurse Corporal Morrison approached was not Lieutenant Yamamoto, but Ensign Sato Michiko, a 22-year-old from Osaka who had been attempting to treat a shrapnel wound to her own abdomen while simultaneously triaging 3 other patients. She had been bleeding for approximately 90 minutes, had lost sufficient blood to induce early-stage shock, and would likely have died within the hour without intervention. When Morrison knelt beside her and reached for his medical kit, she recoiled violently, her hand moving toward the cyanide capsule she wore on a cord around her neck. Morrison did not grab her, did not force treatment. Instead, he simply opened his kit, and the nurses saw something that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of their universe. Morphine syrettes, dozens of them, sulfa powder in paper packets, sterile bandages still in their wax paper wrapping, plasma bottles, surgical instruments that gleamed even in the dim light filtering through the collapsed roof. An abundance of medical supplies that seemed almost obscene to women who had been reusing bandages stripped from corpses, who had been performing amputations with bayonets sterilized in whatever fire they could kindle. The symbolic power of this moment cannot be overstated. For 3 years, the Japanese nurses had operated under conditions of increasing scarcity. Medical supplies had dwindled as American submarines strangled the Empire's supply lines. By 1945, field hospitals were routinely running out of basic necessities, not through inefficiency, but through the simple mathematics of a dying empire consuming itself. The nurses had adapted with resourcefulness born of desperation, boiling seawater for saline solution, fermenting alcohol from sweet potatoes for antiseptic, fashioning surgical needles from fish bones. And here stood their enemies, opening medical kits that contained more supplies than the entire Japanese aid station had possessed at the battle's beginning. It was not merely the abundance, but the casual nature of it, the way the American medics handled these precious resources without reverence, as if morphine were infinite, as if bandages simply materialized from the inexhaustible machinery of American production. Morrison held up a morphine syrette, showing it to Ensign Sato, making his intentions clear through gesture rather than words. He pointed to her wound, to the morphine, then placed the syringe on the ground between them and stepped back. The choice, he indicated, was hers. This small act, this granting of agency to an enemy combatant, represented something the Japanese military structure did not accommodate. In the imperial system, orders flowed downward with absolute authority. Subordinates did not choose, they obeyed. Yet here was the enemy offering rather than commanding, respecting rather than conquering. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Ensign Sato looked at Lieutenant Yamamoto. The lieutenant, whose hands still pressed against the dying private's wound, whose eyes had seen things in China that had carved deep lines beside her mouth, understood in that moment that everything she had been told about the Americans was either incomplete or deliberately false. She had expected brutality and found mercy. She had expected violation and found respect. She had expected the end and found instead an impossible continuation. She nodded once. Permission granted. What followed in the next 73 minutes would be documented in the after-action report filed by Second Lieutenant Robert Chun, the medical officer commanding the evacuation team, and later archived in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where it would rest largely unexamined until a graduate student researching wartime medical practices discovered it in 1987. The report's clinical language cannot capture the emotional weight of what transpired, but the facts it records are illuminating. 17 Japanese nurses were found alive in the collapsed aid station. All 17 were wounded to varying degrees, for were in critical condition requiring immediate surgical intervention. The American medics stabilized all 4, treated the remaining 13, and arranged evacuation to the beach, where they were transported to the hospital ship USS Tranquility anchored offshore. Not a single nurse died in American custody during the evacuation. But here is what Second Lieutenant Chen's report cannot capture: the moment when the Japanese nurses realized they were being treated before the American wounded. The Marines had taken significant casualties in the approach to the aid station. Several wounded Americans lay in shell craters barely 30 meters from where the nurses huddled. Standard triage protocol dictated treating American casualties first, evacuating them to definitive care, then returning for enemy wounded if time and resources permitted. But Corporal Morrison and his team had assessed the situation and reached a different conclusion. The Japanese nurses' wounds were more critical, and the American casualties were stable enough to wait. This decision, made in seconds under fire by exhausted medics operating on instinct shaped by training and culture, revealed a fundamental truth about the society that had sent them across the Pacific. In the American calculus, medical need superseded nationality. The most critically wounded patient received treatment first, regardless of the uniform they wore. This principle, enshrined in the Geneva Conventions but honored more in breach than observance by most combatant nations, was to the Americans not idealistic but practical. Medical resources should be allocated according to medical need because any other system was inefficient. To the Japanese nurses, who had been taught that Japanese lives possessed inherently greater value than those of lesser races, who had seen their own military leave wounded soldiers behind when retreat became necessary, who understood death before dishonor as the highest virtue. This prioritization was incomprehensible. Lieutenant Yamamoto watched as Corporal Morrison administered morphine to Ensign Sato, watched him clean and dress the abdominal wound with supplies he used as casually as if they were infinite, watched him call for a stretcher while American wounded still waited. She watched, and something fundamental shifted in her understanding of the world. She had been 28 years old when the war began, old enough to remember a Japan not yet fully militarized, young enough to be swept up in the fervor of national destiny. She had genuinely believed in the civilizing mission, in Japan's divine right to lead Asia out of Western colonialism into prosperity under the emperor's benevolent guidance. She had believed the propaganda about American decadence, about a soft people who valued comfort over honor, who would collapse when faced with the steel of Japanese determination. But watching this young American corporal, who could not have been more than 22, who had probably never traveled more than 100 miles from his Iowa hometown before the military sent him across an ocean to kill and die. Watching him treat her countrywomen with gentle efficiency while his own comrades bled nearby, she understood with terrible clarity that she had been lied to about who the enemy was. The concept of comfort in American military medicine deserves examination because it reveals a profound philosophical divergence between the two societies. Japanese military culture emphasized gambaru, perseverance through suffering, as a cardinal virtue. Pain was character building. Endurance was honorable. The Japanese military medical establishment distributed morphine sparingly, not merely due to supply shortages, but from doctrinal belief that soldiers should maintain stoicism in the face of agony. The American military medical establishment, influenced heavily by progressive-era reforms and industrial efficiency studies, had reached the opposite conclusion. Pain was a distraction that impaired healing and degraded combat effectiveness. Morphine was distributed liberally not from humanitarian concern, but from recognition that comfortable soldiers recovered faster, returned to duty more quickly, and maintained higher morale under sustained combat conditions. This was efficiency, not sentiment. But to the Japanese nurses experiencing this approach for the first time, the distinction between efficiency and humanity became meaningless. When Ensign Sato's face relaxed as the morphine took effect, when her breathing eased and her hands unclenched and the animal fear left her eyes, what Corporal Morrison's motives had been mattered less than what he had done. The nurses began to weep, not loudly. 3 years of military discipline had trained emotional suppression too deeply for that, but silently, tears cutting clean lines through the volcanic ash coating their faces. They wept not from pain or fear or relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition of their own humanity reflected in the eyes of those they had been taught to consider subhuman. Private First Class David Gonzalez from Albuquerque, New Mexico, treating a nurse with severe burns on her hands and forearms, noticed her tears and misunderstood them as pain response. He administered additional morphine. Speaking softly in English she could not understand, his tone conveying what language could not. She wept harder, and he increased the dosage, his concern deepening, creating a feedback loop of misunderstanding that somehow arrived at the same destination: compassion. The symbolic object that would dominate the nurse's later testimonies was not morphine or bandages, but water. Clean water. Cool water. Water that did not taste of sulfur and ash. Water offered in American canteens with casual generosity, as if water itself were not precious, as if the giver assumed more would always be available, as if abundance were the natural state of the universe rather than scarcity. For 6 days the nurses had been drinking what little water could be collected in helmets from the rare rain shower, supplemented by a single well that had been contaminated by corpses on the 3rd day of battle. They had been rationing their intake to dangerous levels, prioritizing the wounded, accepting the dizziness and confusion of dehydration as necessary sacrifice. And here came these Americans offering water, not as reward or currency or bargaining chip, but simply because people required water and they had water to give. Lieutenant Yamamoto accepted a canteen from 2nd Lieutenant Shun, who had come forward from the beach to assess the evacuation. She drank, and the water was cold. Actually cold, somehow preserved at temperature through chemical ice packs the Americans carried in their medical supplies. She drank and tasted metal and chlorine and something ineffable that she would later describe as the taste of plenty. She had been prepared to die on this island, had accepted it, had made peace with it, and now she would live, pulled back from the edge not by her own people, but by strangers who owed her nothing, who had every right to leave her die as the natural consequence of her nation's aggression, who instead treated her wounds and gave her cold water and called for a stretcher to carry her to safety. The ideological foundation upon which she had constructed her adult identity collapsed in that moment, as surely as the aid station's roof had collapsed under American artillery. If the Americans were subhuman, what did that make their mercy? If Japan was divinely destined to rule, why was she being saved by those she was meant to conquer? If death before dishonor was the highest virtue, What honor was there in survival granted by the enemy's compassion? The historical record of Japanese military nurses taken prisoner in the Pacific Theater is sparse but suggestive. Of the estimated 12,000 women who served in the Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps during the war, fewer than 300 survived to become prisoners of war. The majority died in combat zones, some from wounds, some from disease, many by their own hands when capture became imminent. The Japanese military's indoctrination regarding American treatment of prisoners was sufficiently effective that mass suicides became routine when positions were overrun. The 17 nurses evacuated from Iwo Jima represented a statistical anomaly, a group that survived both the trauma of capture and the subsequent disillusionment of discovering that everything they had been taught about the enemy was false. Their testimonies, recorded in the 1980s and 1990s by Japanese historians researching the wartime medical corps, reveal a consistent pattern of profound psychological disruption followed by difficult reintegration into post-war Japanese society. Lieutenant Yamamoto Keiko's testimony, recorded in 1989 during an oral history project conducted by Waseda University, is particularly illuminating. She describes the evacuation to the USS Tranquility in terms that emphasize not the medical treatment, which was competent but unremarkable by American standards, but the small gestures of humanity that surrounded it. The sailor who noticed her shivering and brought a blanket. The nurse who braided her hair because it had come loose and was tangling in the bandages. The doctor who asked, through an interpreter, whether she had family who should be notified she was alive. This last question haunted her. The concept that the enemy would care about her family, would attempt to reduce their suffering by informing them of her survival, was so foreign to her understanding of warfare that she initially thought she had misunderstood the translation. When the interpreter confirmed the question, she began to weep again. 44 years later, recounting this moment to a graduate student with a tape recorder, her voice broke and the interview had to be paused. The USS Tranquility was a Haven-class hospital ship, purpose-built for casualty evacuation and equipped with operating theaters, X-ray facilities, a fully stocked pharmacy, and medical staff trained in the latest trauma care techniques. To the Japanese nurses, who had operated field hospitals equipped with little more than basic surgical kits and what supplies could be improvised from local materials, the Tranquility seemed less like a ship than a vision of some impossible future. The abundance was almost obscene. Medications existed in quantities sufficient that they could be discarded after single use rather than carefully preserved. Bandages were changed not because they were saturated, but simply because protocol dictated regular changes to prevent infection. Food. The meals served to patients included meat, fresh vegetables, bread with butter, coffee with sugar. Food arrived in portions that would have fed an entire Japanese field hospital for a day. Ensign Sato, recovering from abdominal surgery in a private room with white sheets and a working light overhead, asked the interpreter how many hospital ships America possessed. When told that the Tranquility was one of 15 currently operating in the Pacific Theater alone, she fell silent for nearly 10 minutes. The mathematics was too devastating to process quickly. Japan had begun the war with a single hospital ship, which had been sunk in 1942. America had industrialized mercy the same way it had industrialized everything else, mass-producing compassion with the same efficiency it manufactured tanks and aircraft. This realization, that American material superiority extended even to humanitarian resources, carried implications the nurses struggled to articulate. It suggested that America could afford to be merciful, that the gentle treatment they received was not ideological commitment, but casual overflow of abundance, so vast the nation could simultaneously prosecute total war and maintain humanitarian standards without strain. But this interpretation, while partly accurate, missed something essential. The Americans' treatment of prisoners did reflect material abundance, but it also reflected cultural values shaped by that abundance over generations. A society that had never known true scarcity could afford to develop elaborate ethical frameworks around human dignity. A people who had never faced existential threat could afford to treat individual life as sacred. Mercy was easier when it did not require sacrifice. Yet this observation cuts both ways. The Japanese nurses, products of a culture formed by resource scarcity, had developed resilience and resourcefulness the Americans could barely comprehend. They had endured conditions that would have broken most Americans within days. They had adapted, improvised, persevered through circumstances that would have seemed impossible. Their strength was real, their devotion genuine, their courage absolute. What they had lacked, what their society had never taught them, was that strength could coexist with gentleness, that resilience need not require brutality, that it was possible to value both individual dignity and collective obligation. The Americans, born into plenty, had never had to choose between them. Lieutenant Yamamoto spent 17 days aboard the Tranquility before being transferred to a POW facility in Guam. During that time, she was visited daily by a Japanese-American nurse named Helen Tanaka, a Nisei from San Francisco whose parents remained in an internment camp in California while she served in the Pacific Theater. The irony that America imprisoned its own citizens for their ancestry while simultaneously treating enemy prisoners with Geneva Convention-mandated dignity was not lost on either woman. Their conversations, conducted in Japanese, ranged across topics neither would have imagined discussing before the war: food, family, the small details of daily life in peacetime. Helen described San Francisco before Pearl Harbor, the neighborhood where her family had owned a grocery store, the internment order that had given them 48 hours to sell everything they owned. She described this without apparent bitterness, as simple fact, which Keiko found perhaps most disturbing of all. Keiko asked the question that haunted her: how can you serve them after what they did to your family? Helen's answer would stay with her for the rest of her life. Because they also gave my family the right to protest what they did. Because when the war ends, my father will sue the government, and the government will hear his case, and maybe he'll lose, but maybe he'll win. And either way, the fact that he could try means something. It means the system believes it can be wrong. Your government, could you sue it? The question was rhetorical. Under the Meiji Constitution, the emperor was sacred and inviolable, beyond criticism, legally incapable of error. The concept of citizens holding their government accountable for injustice was not merely impractical, but literally inconceivable within the imperial system. This conversation crystallized something Keiko had been struggling to articulate. The Americans' treatment of prisoners reflected not merely abundance or efficiency, but a fundamentally different conception of governmental authority. The Japanese state existed above the people, sacred, unchallengeable, demanding absolute loyalty. The American state existed, at least in theory, beneath the people, created by them, answerable to them, subject to perpetual modification according to their will. This did not mean America lived up to its ideals. Helen's family's internment proved it did not, but the existence of the ideals mattered. They created space for criticism, for reform, for evolution. They established standards against which practice could be measured and found wanting. They made hypocrisy visible, which was a first step toward correcting it. Japan had no equivalent framework. There was orthodoxy and there was betrayal. There was service and there was shame. There was no middle ground where one could honor the nation while criticizing its government. No space to question whether divine destiny might be delusion. The transformation occurring within Lieutenant Yamamoto and her fellow nurses during their captivity was not simple disillusionment. Disillusionment suggests the loss of false beliefs, leaving behind only cynicism or despair. What the nurses experienced was more complex. The simultaneous collapse of their ideological foundation and the unwelcome recognition that their captors possessed virtues they had been taught only Japan exemplified. This was cognitively and emotionally destabilizing to a degree difficult for those who have never experienced comprehensive ideological collapse to fully appreciate. Every belief, every value, every assumption about how the world functioned required re-examination. If the Americans were not subhuman, perhaps other peoples the empire had conquered were not inferior. If defeat was possible, perhaps divine protection was myth. If survival was acceptable, perhaps all those who had died choosing honor over capture had died unnecessarily. This last thought was unbearable. The nurses had watched friends and patients choose death over the dishonor of capture. They had administered morphine overdoses as mercy when evacuation was impossible. They had held hands as women younger than themselves had bitten down on cyanide capsules rather than face what they believed awaited them in American custody. And all of it, all that death, all that sacrifice, had been based on lies. The psychological literature on radical belief change suggests that individuals experiencing this kind of comprehensive worldview collapse typically follow one of three paths. They double down on their original beliefs, rejecting contradictory evidence as deception. They undergo complete conversion, embracing the opposing ideology with zealot fervor. Or they retreat into pragmatic agnosticism, avoiding grand ideological commitments in favor of immediate concrete concerns. The Japanese nurses' testimonies suggest most followed the third path. They did not become American patriots. That would have been yet another form of self-betrayal. Instead, they developed profound skepticism toward all totalizing ideologies, all claims of national supremacy, all demands for absolute loyalty. They had believed completely once. They would never believe completely again. This psychological transformation had profound implications for their post-war lives. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1946, part of a prisoner exchange following the war's end. She found her hometown of Hiroshima transformed into a wasteland of shadows and ash. Her mother had died in the atomic bombing. Her father had survived, but died of radiation sickness 3 months later. The house where she had grown up existed only as a foundation of scorched stones. She could have blamed the Americans. Many did. But she had drunk cold water from an American canteen, while American medics treated her wounds before treating their own comrades. She had been shown mercy when her own propaganda had insisted none would be offered. The cognitive dissonance was insurmountable. How could she hate those who had saved her while her own government had lied to her, spent her life carelessly, and ultimately immolated her family in a war it had started and could not win? She blamed no one. She blamed everyone. She retreated into the pragmatic agnosticism that would characterize the rest of her life, became a nurse again in the rebuilt Hiroshima, treated atomic bomb survivors with the same meticulous care she had once devoted to imperial soldiers, and never spoke of the war unless directly asked. When graduate students began researching the wartime medical corps in the 1980s, she initially refused interviews. Only when informed that her testimony would be part of a historical archive meant to ensure future generations understood the reality of war rather than its mythology did she agree to speak. Her testimony, dry and factual for most of its 37 pages, breaks down only twice. First, when describing the moment Corporal Morrison offered morphine to Ensign Sato. Second, when describing the day she learned Hiroshima had been destroyed while she lay safe aboard an American hospital ship, receiving medical care superior to what most Japanese civilians could access even in peacetime. "I survived," she told the interviewer, "because the enemy was more merciful than my own government." What does that say about everything I believed? What does that say about every sacrifice I witnessed? I cannot answer these questions. I am 81 years old, and I still cannot answer these questions. The broader implications of the Iwo Jima aid station incident extend beyond the individual experiences of 17 women. The episode encapsulates a fundamental asymmetry that characterized the Pacific War. Two societies with radically different conceptions of human value colliding in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The Japanese military system, forged over centuries of feudal warrior tradition and modernized during the Meiji Restoration, conceptualized individuals as expendable components of the national organism. This was not cruelty, but coherent philosophy. The individual achieved immortality through subsumption into the eternal nation. Death in service to the emperor was not tragedy, but transcendence. To die well was the highest achievement. To surrender was to choose shame over glory. non-existence over eternal honor. This philosophy produced soldiers of extraordinary courage and determination. It also produced soldiers who bayonet prisoners, who treated conquered populations with savage brutality, who committed atrocities as routine extensions of their conviction that Japanese lives possessed inherently greater value than others. The philosophy was coherent within its own framework, but that framework was incompatible with any form of universal human dignity. The American military system, despite its own profound flaws and hypocrisies, operated from a different philosophical foundation. The individual possessed inalienable value not from service to the state, but as inherent attribute of personhood. This concept emerged from Enlightenment philosophy, Christian theology, and the specific historical experience of a settler society that had defined itself in opposition to European aristocracy. It was honored more in breach than observance. The treatment of African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities proved America's massive failure to apply its stated principles consistently. But the principles existed, and they shaped institutional behavior even when individual prejudice resisted. When these two systems met in combat, the clash transcended mere military conflict. It was a confrontation between incompatible ideas about what human beings were for, what societies owed their members, what obligations existed between victor and vanquished. The American medics who treated Japanese nurses before treating their own wounded were not heroes making conscious moral choices. They were technicians following doctrine shaped by cultural values so deep they had become invisible. But doctrine matters. Culture matters. The ideas societies teach their children about human value accumulate over generations into institutions and reflexes that manifest in 10,000 small decisions made under pressure. Corporal Morrison probably never thought about philosophical implications when he offered morphine to Ensign Sato. He saw a wounded patient. His training said, treat wounded patients. The simplicity of that equation, the absence of ideological complications, the purely technical nature of the assessment, was itself the product of an ideology so pervasive it no longer registered as ideology. The symbol that dominated the nurse's later recollections was neither morphine, nor bandages, nor even water, but something more subtle: the stretchers. American stretchers were canvas and aluminum, lightweight and collapsible, designed for rapid evacuation. Two medics could carry a wounded soldier a kilometer in 15 minutes. The stretchers had handles that didn't cut into hands, straps that secured patients without chafing, padding that provided some small measure of comfort during transport. Japanese stretchers were bamboo and rope, heavy and rigid, requiring 4 men to carry effectively. They were improvised from local materials because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture and distribute purpose-built equipment across its vast conquered territories. They functioned barely, but the difference between functioning and engineering for human comfort was the difference between surviving and being cared for. When the American medics carried the Japanese nurses on their aluminum stretchers from the ruined aid station to the beach, the nurses felt that difference in their bodies. The padding that cushioned their wounds. The straps that held them secure without binding. The smooth efficiency of movement that minimized jostling. These small mercies multiplied across every piece of equipment, every protocol, every institutional decision, accumulated into a gestalt of care that communicated volumes about the societies that produced them. Lieutenant Yamamoto, being carried across volcanic ash toward the beach and the ships, and the impossible continuation of her life, looked up at the gray Pacific sky and understood that she had lost more than a battle. She had lost certainty. She had lost the comfort of absolute conviction. She had lost the clarity that comes from believing one's own people are righteous and one's enemies are evil. What she gained in exchange was the terrible burden of nuance, the understanding that virtue and vice exist in all societies, that mercy and cruelty are not national characteristics, but human universals, that the difference between barbarism and civilization is measured not in grand pronouncements, but in the accumulation of small choices about how to treat the vulnerable when no one is watching. She would spend the rest of her life teaching this lesson to nurses in training in Hiroshima, though she rarely made it explicit. She taught technique, how to assess wounds, how to prioritize triage, how to work efficiently under resource constraints. But she also taught by example and occasional story that patients were never merely bodies to be processed, but persons whose dignity required preservation, even in extremity. That pain relief was moral obligation, not optional luxury. That the measure of a medical system was how it treated those it could discard without consequence. Her students, born into post-war prosperity, never having known the deprivation she had endured, sometimes struggled to understand why she insisted on certain practices that seemed inefficient. Why waste time comforting a patient who would die anyway? Why use expensive medications when cheaper alternatives existed? Why treat the homeless alcoholic with the same priority as the respectable businessman? She would answer with the same story, told so many times it became ritual. On Iwo Jima, I was treated by the enemy with more care than my own military had shown me in 3 years. This was not because Americans are better than Japanese. It was because they had built systems that treated care as default rather than exception. We must build the same systems. We must ensure that no patient, regardless of circumstance, ever feels that their suffering is acceptable cost of efficiency. In the decades following the war, Lieutenant Yamamoto maintained correspondence with exactly one American, Helen Tanaka, the Nisei nurse who had visited her aboard the USS Tranquility. Helen had survived the war, returned to San Francisco, and devoted her career to public health nursing in underserved communities. The letters, written in English by Helen and Japanese by Keiko, translated painstakingly by bilingual friends, continued until Helen's death in 1987. The correspondence reveals two women processing shared trauma through radically different cultural frameworks. Helen wrote about her parents' lawsuit against the U.S. government over internment, which was dismissed in 1949 but laid groundwork for later civil rights victories. She wrote about participating in the civil rights movement, treating freedom riders beaten by segregationist mobs, confronting American hypocrisy with the same clinical precision she had once applied to combat wounds. Keiko wrote about Hiroshima's reconstruction, the atomic bomb survivors she treated, the peculiar horror of radiation sickness that killed with mathematical precision months or years after exposure. She wrote about the American occupation, which she experienced with profound ambivalence. Gratitude for food, aid, and medical supplies, resentment at being conquered, confusion about whether Japan was being punished or rebuilt. She wrote about teaching nursing to a generation with no memory of war, try to convey lessons about human dignity to young women who had never seen it systematically violated. Neither woman ever fully reconciled the contradictions they embodied. Helen served the nation that had imprisoned her family. Keiko owed her life to the nation that had incinerated her hometown. They existed in permanent tension between loyalty and betrayal, gratitude and rage, mercy received and mercy denied. Their final exchange of letters, in early 1987, shortly before Helen's death from lung cancer, turned philosophical in ways their earlier correspondence had avoided. Helen wrote, "I used to think that the war taught me who the enemy was. Now I think it taught me that the enemy is certainty, the conviction that we know who deserves mercy and who deserves destruction. The moment we become certain, we become capable of anything." Keiko's response, which arrived 3 weeks after Helen's death and was returned unopened, contained this passage. "You are correct that certainty is dangerous, but I fear uncertainty equally. I spent 3 years certain I served righteousness, then 40 years certain of nothing. Which life was wasted? The one spent serving false gods, or the one spent serving no gods at all? I am 81 years old and I still do not know." The epilogue to this story is both simple and impossibly complex. 17 Japanese nurses were evacuated from Iwo Jima in February 1945. 13 survived the war. Of those 13, 3 immigrated to South America in the 1950s, 2 scarred by what they had witnessed to remain in Japan. 2 committed suicide, one in 1948 and one in 1963, their deaths officially attributed to illness but understood by those close to them as delayed casualties of ideological collapse. 8 remained in Japan, returned to nursing, raised families, and carried their experiences as private burdens they rarely shared. Lieutenant Yamamoto Keiko was the last survivor, dying in 1992 at age 78. Her obituary in the Hiroshima newspaper was 3 sentences, noting her service in the war and her subsequent career as a nursing instructor. It did not mention Iwo Jima. It did not mention the American medics who had treated her wounds before treating their own. It did not mention the profound transformation that had occurred in a collapsed aid station during the war's final months. But those who knew her, her students, her colleagues, the patients who benefited from the standards of care she insisted upon, they knew. They knew that she had encountered something on that volcanic island that had changed not just her understanding of the war, but her understanding of what human beings owed each other. They knew that she had been shown mercy and had spent the rest of her life trying to deserve it by extending the same mercy to others. The final entry in her personal diary, discovered after her death, is dated February 13th, 1992, one day before the 47th anniversary of the aid station evacuation. It reads, "I have been asked many times if I am grateful to the Americans who saved my life. This is the wrong question. Gratitude implies debt, and debt implies relationship between individua. But those who knew her, her students, her colleagues, the patients who benefited from the standards of care she insisted upon, they knew. They knew that she had encountered something on that volcanic island that had changed not just her understanding of the war, but her understanding of what human beings owed each other. They knew that she had been shown mercy and had spent the rest of her life trying to deserve it by extending the same mercy to others." The final entry in her personal diary, discovered after her death, is dated February 13th, 1992, one day before the 47th anniversary of the aid station evacuation. It reads, "I have been asked many times if I am grateful to the Americans who saved my life. This is the wrong question. Gratitude implies debt, and debt implies relationship between individuals. What I experienced was not individual kindness, but systemic mercy, the accumulated result of 10,000 decisions made by people I never met, who build institutions that valued life over ideology. I'm not grateful. I am haunted. I am haunted by the knowledge that such systems are possible, and by the question of why my own society did not build them. I am haunted by everyone who died believing lies I also believed. I am haunted by the cold water that tasted like plenty. I am haunted by the Americans who wept silent, knowing they had been taught to fear what they should have recognized as shared humanity. I will carry this haunting until my death, which I hope comes soon. I am tired of remembering. She died the next morning, quietly, in her sleep. The small glass vial that had once held cyanide, which she had carried every day for 47 years, empty but present, a reminder of the death she had chosen and the life she had been granted instead, was found in her nightstand, carefully labeled in her own handwriting, February 14th, 1945. The day I learned that mercy is not weakness. The day I learned that my enemies were human. The day I learned that I knew nothing. That vial, along with her diary and her letters from Helen Tanaka, was donated to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, where it resides in the archives, available to researchers but rarely requested. It is a small object, easily overlooked, carrying a story that does not fit comfortably into narratives of either Japanese victimhood or American righteousness. It is simply evidence that war destroys not only bodies but certainties, and that sometimes the most profound casualties are the beliefs that die when mercy arrives from unexpected quarters. The American medics who evacuated those 17 nurses returned to their units, completed their tours, went home to Iowa and New Mexico and California. Most never knew what their actions had meant to the women they saved. They had done their jobs, followed their training, and moved on to the next crisis. This, too, is part of the story, that mercy can be simultaneously individual and systematic, that the most profound kindness is sometimes the kind so routine it requires no recognition, that civilization is built not on moments of exceptional virtue, but on institutions that make compassion ordinary. On February 14th, 1945, in a collapsed aid station on a volcanic island in the Pacific, 17 women learned that everything they believed about their enemies was false. They learned it through morphine and bandages and cold water, through stretchers designed for comfort and protocols that valued life. They learned it not through propaganda or argument, but through the simple shock of being treated with dignity when they had been taught to expect only death. This lesson, that mercy can arrive from unexpected quarters, that humanity persists even in humanity's worst moments, that systems and cultures and institutions shape individual capacity for compassion. This lesson is perhaps the war's most important and least celebrated legacy. It cannot be captured in memorial inscriptions or commemorative ceremonies. It lives only in small stories, archived testimonies, forgotten letters between two nurses who spent their post-war lives trying to build systems that would prevent future generations from learning the same terrible lesson at the same terrible cost. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima has long since settled. The aid station's ruins have been consumed by vegetation and time. The participants have all died, carrying their private reckonings to graves scattered across 2 continents. But the question Lieutenant Yamamoto could never answer: what do we owe each other, even when everything says we are enemies? That question persists as urgent now as it was in that moment when American hands offered morphine to Japanese wounds and the world briefly reorganized itself around mercy instead of vengeance. Some truths can only be learned through their violation. Some lessons can only be taught by their absence. The Japanese nurses learned about systematic human dignity only after experiencing its opposite, only after being saved by those their ideology insisted could not possess such virtue. They carried that knowledge as burden and gift both, haunted by what they had learned, unable to unknow it, unable to reconcile it with the certainties that had once given their lives meaning. In the end, perhaps this is all we can ask, that suffering produce wisdom, that violence generate commitment to its prevention, that the terrible lessons of the past echo forward as warning and as hope. The nurses of Iwo Jima paid an unbearable price for their education and mercy. The least we can do is remember what they learned and why the learning costs so much and why the systems that make such learning unnecessary are worth building even when, especially when, the building requires us to extend dignity to those we have been taught to consider enemies. The cold water still tastes like plenty, even across 77 years. The question it raises still demands an answer. In a world of abundance, why do we choose scarcity of mercy? In a world where care is possible, why do we default to cruelty? These questions have no simple answers, but they have evidence scattered across the historical record like shrapnel from forgotten battles. 17 women, 17 lives, 17 testimonies that sometimes the enemy saves you. And sometimes being saved is more devastating than death because it forces you to acknowledge that everyone you let die might have been saved if only you had been taught to see them as human first. This is the legacy of February 14th, 1945. Not victory or defeat, not heroism or cowardice, but the quiet revolution that occurs when mercy arrives from unexpected quarters and transforms everything it touches. The nurses wept silently. The medics worked efficiently. The stretchers carried their human cargo toward ships and uncertain futures. And somewhere in that exchange, beneath the ash and the blood and the machinery of war, a truth asserted itself that no amount of propaganda could fully suppress. We are all capable of mercy, and we are all in need of it, and the distance between enemy and saved is sometimes no greater than the length of a morphine syringe offered by hands that chose to heal before confirming the nationality of the wound.